Good morning. It's Jim Vanderwall with the Fraser Basin Council. Thanks to all of you who've joined us already for our webinar on working with thermal cameras. We'll get started in a couple of minutes, but we'll just let a few more people join before we start. So hang tight, and there's also information up on the screen about audio connection. If you're finding your computer audio is not good, there's also a phone connection that you can use. Well, good morning. It's Jim Vanderwall of Fraser Basin Council, and welcome to our webinar today on working with Thermal Cameras 101. This is part of our First Nations Home Energy Save series. For those of you that haven't participated in our webinars to date, you can use your computer to connect over the audio, or we've got the phone number for connection there if that works better for you. This is part of a number of activities that we've got happening to support First Nations communities and support organizations that are trying to reduce energy use and provide opportunities for building capacity and share information about what's happening. So I'd also like to thank our many supporters, including the Real Estate Foundation of BC, BC Housing, the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources, and BC Hydro. We've also got some information on our webpage at, if you go to fnenergy.ca, it brings you right to these pages. So there are things like some community success stories. For those of you that would like to, you can sign up on our email list so you hear about upcoming events. We also have recordings of all the past webinars available, so you can listen to those if you miss something or if you would like to go back to retrieve other information. So that's also available on the website. Just also wanted to mention that there's a few spots left. We do have an upcoming workshop on May 11th near Hope, BC. It's being hosted in partnership with Yale First Nation and the BC First Nation Housing Mentorship Program. And it will feature a couple of new things compared to some of our previous workshops. It includes a field visit to Yale First Nation and their Passive Homes project. And as well, there'll be a practical demonstration training session on air sealing and insulation. So if you have, if you're interested in attending, just get in touch with us if you haven't already received the invitation for that. Just a couple of logistical things before we launch into the webinar here. One is that in order for you to be able to hear the speakers, we keep the audio muted. We do encourage you to ask questions, and so we do that through the question box feature. You can type in your question at any time. We'll get to those questions at the end after our speaker's presentation. My colleague Elena Chia is available if you have any technical difficulties. You can email her at fraserbasin@gmail.com and she'll try to help you out to make sure that you can access the webinar. So our speaker today is Kevin Welsh. He's with Cool North Shore. He's a board member there, and he's also a senior sustainability consultant with Integral Group. He's involved in sustainable design and certification of a variety of building types in the Vancouver market. Since joining the Cool North Shore program in 2015 as a volunteer and board member, Kevin leads the Cool Neighborhoods program. With a background in high performance building design as a lead AP and certified passive house consultant, Kevin has 5 years in the green building industry, following 3 years as a contractor building and renovating single family residences. So I'm going to just turn things over to Kevin, so just bear with us for a minute here while we pass the baton over.
Oh. Excellent. Okay, so we're coming through here?
Yep, that looks great, Kevin.
Excellent. Okay, hi everybody. So as Jim mentioned, the intent here today is to walk through a little bit of our experience with thermal imaging equipment, primarily how it can be applied to the single family home as part of a ongoing thermal energy audit process. And the intent being to hopefully leave most of you with the information you would need to either identify and equip yourself with the types of thermal imaging equipment you would need, or at least use whatever equipment might be available to you effectively in identifying opportunities for energy savings in a single family home. So as part of that, we're gonna start pretty high level, ideally talking about how thermal imaging works and most of the applications you might find. A lot of what we'll discuss lends itself well to why there's such a variety of thermal imaging equipment in the marketplace. And so if you do choose to go shopping, understanding a little bit about that will help you in understanding what type of camera would best suit your application and hopefully allow you to make the most informed decision that way. After that, we will stop for a quick survey and hopefully get a good understanding of where everybody is relative to their experience with single family homes and the energy auditing process as a whole, before we spend a fair bit of the presentation discussing the specific process by which we've found the thermal energy audit works best in a single family home application. And I guess some of the things we recommend you avoid when trying to develop your own program and introduce these ideas to owners and occupants alike. And then as usual, we'll have a little bit of a question and answer period at the end where we can review some of the survey results. So as Jim had mentioned, I'm with the Cool North Shore. I'm currently managing the Cool Neighborhoods program. We were effectively launched in North Vancouver about 8 years ago, I believe, but we serve multiple communities in both the North Shore, and we're looking to expand all the time. Primarily what we do is we facilitate conversations around climate change, and we advocate for home energy efficiency as a means of mitigating and adapting to that future energy issues. We have programs like our Cool Drinks events where we bring in industry leaders and facilitators to discuss major energy related topics. We've discussed things like the BC Step Code, climate change and resiliency. And we have a conversation this month happening around food supply and home gardening and stuff like that. What we're going to be talking about today is primarily our experience around the Cool Neighborhoods program. As I mentioned, this is a program which primarily focuses on delivering in-home thermal energy audits. We like to refer to them as thermal imaging blitzes, where we go into a community and we identify 5 or 6 neighbors all interested in energy efficiency. And we kind of go through a neighborhood and we connect them around the ideas of energy efficiency. The idea is that we're both trying to draw communities together as well as inform them about energy and climate change as a whole. If you are interested in our organization or any of our programs, I'd encourage you to check out our website, thecoolnorthshore.ca. Under info, if you know of or are interested in understanding more about our programming, you're welcome to send us an email and we'll gladly respond to you and start organizing a bit of information if You might have a community that you're interested in. So transitioning into that, I think it's important to start our conversation around thermal imaging by understanding exactly what it is that thermal imaging equipment does. When we look at the light that we can see with our eyes, the visible light spectrum, it's actually a very small piece of the electromagnetic spectrum. You most often understand it as, FM radio waves or TV waves, shortwave antennas, stuff like that. But what we're interested in for the purposes of our thermal imagers is specifically infrared rays. So this is commonly associated with heat. It produces light at an infrared spectrum, which is not visible to our naked eye, but the sensors on the thermal imaging equipment you're going to find will have the ability to see these types of infrared waves. In terms of applications, the original uses of thermal imaging was developed in industry primarily. So it was used in industrial applications to find hot wires and malfunctioning motors and pumps in applications where you have to do a lot of investigation in a short amount of time. When you consider large-scale industrial applications, the idea is that by finding the hot wire or the hot pump, they can better understand exactly whether or not that equipment's working to its full efficiency and better identify when and where it needs to be replaced. It has since been adopted into other home inspections, so primarily looking for ground faults and underground wires and different pieces like that. And we've seen other applications in search and rescue and law enforcement as a means of obviously identifying people in the dark when perhaps visible light is not readily available. In the context of our conversation today, what I'm interested in focusing on most, though, is its application in energy assessments. So what we can use our thermal imaging for is to identify things like air leakage, potential compromises in the insulation or missing insulation altogether. It does identify things like water damage, and we have seen in some instances the ability to identify unwelcome guests. That primarily addresses rodents, but seldom do we find mysterious people living in attics. When we're talking about selecting our equipment, the type of camera can be very important and defines the success of your program in our experience. There's a lot of manufacturers out in the market. FLIR and Fluke, they're the most established brands that we've worked with so far, though Seek does have some pretty successful products, and we've seen some positive reviews and some good work done with them in the past. And given the variety of manufacturers, there is a pretty sizable range in the price of equipment. We have seen in recent releases with the uptake of smartphones, an increased use of these Android apps and smartphone plugins. There's also the traditional handheld unit, and then there are also the larger industrial full imaging units. So those are the types of equipment you would strap onto a search helicopter or something like that. What the images on the right are meant to identify is kind of the range of equipment that you might encounter when you're looking for your own thermal imager. Something like the HT175, that's a great example of a handheld tool. It has limited functionality and the image resolution is not particularly powerful on it, and that can be a hurdle when you're trying to identify specific thermal imaging issues. But it does a good job of demonstrating how infrared light works. You can find hot spots and cold spots. And so depending on the extent of your program, you could get away with lower cost imagery equipment versus some of the higher cost imagers. We have had experience with the FLIR One as well. We've recommended thermal imagers like the Seek Reveal, and our imager is something in line with the Fluke TIS 55. Admittedly, this camera has more power than probably what we use for our program, but it is useful to understand and contextualize the range in which you can get equipment and understand that when you're trying to pick the equipment that suits your program best. When we're talking about selecting our equipment, you should really be searching for it in the same way you would any other camera. The idea is to understand what you're going to be using that camera for before you go and attempt to manage your program around it. So, for example, with our program, we like to focus on some pretty high level energy issues, but we also enjoy the ability to provide pinpoint accuracy and detail with where those cold spots might be. For that reason, we chose to go with the higher end, more detailed equipment when we initially bought our imager. It's also important to note the usability and understand the ideas around who will be using that equipment. If it's a lending program or if it's a program where you'll have multiple users borrowing the camera in and out, it'll be important to understand how accessible that camera is and whether or not they can actually make use of it, or whether it's the type of technology that can be learned once and then should ideally be managed by the same person throughout. And then ultimately understanding where and how you're going to be managing those results are important as well. In our experience, what we've found is that knowing how that imager outputs its images can make a big difference in the convenience around reporting. Some imagers have proprietary imaging software, which means that they don't produce traditional JPEGs, which means it's difficult to put into a report, for example, without fully understanding and having the proper conversion software to make sure that image can kind of transfer across. When we get into the camera part of the thermal imager, it works exactly the same as any other camera you might find in the marketplace. Ideally, we're looking for the best resolution picture we can find. In our search of the market, we found that the maximum amount of pixels before you start to get into extremely expensive equipment is in around the 220 by 165 pixel range. It is the best quality image we've seen, but it can also be the most expensive and somewhat prohibitive for smaller organizations. Where we do find the sweet spot is in around the 160 by 100 pixel range. This is kind of like that Seek product we were looking at earlier. It provides a good, affordable value for most of the imagers you'd find without compromising significantly on what you can see with the imager itself. What I would advise you avoid are things with the lower resolution and ultimately the lowest cost product. When you're trying to illustrate the values of one thermal issue over another, having that level of detail is important. And in our experience with an 80 by 80 pixel image, it's not particularly strong. Other things to consider in the same way you would any other camera is the media storage. So understanding if you can pop the SD card out and whether you can upload photos quickly or whether it's an integrated memory which needs to be plugged in. Depending on the nature of your program, understanding whether or not the battery life will meet the requirements is also helpful. Anecdotally, our experience with our Cool Neighborhoods blitzes has been that if we go beyond 5 homes, we often have to do a small talk interlude with the owner of the 5th home so that we have an opportunity to charge our imager, because it was really designed for kind of shorter term industrial reviews, not necessarily the 5 or 6 hour long blitzes that we're doing. And so that's a bit of a lesson learned there. As I mentioned before, usability, the interface, the number of buttons, how many screens and images you have to go through in order to adjust any of the settings. That's all something that you should consider when you're testing or considering your equipment. And the last piece I would leave everybody with before going out and buying their own thermal imaging equipment is ultimately to do some due diligence in consumer reporting. The images on the right are actually purposely set up to demonstrate how much variability there is in the marketplace. What you'll notice on the top left-hand corner is that there's a FLIR image which suggests it's 80 by 60 pixels, which is in complete alignment with the low image quality that we were talking about before. But the image on the right-hand side against which they're comparing suggests a resolution of about 384 by 200, which is very, very high for the market, and it looks as though it's a phone application, which doesn't seem to align with our understanding of the market. So similarly, you can have higher resolution images like the Seek thermal image on the bottom left-hand corner against the perceived lower resolution image of the FLIR E6. All of these things need to be considered, and I highly recommend you do a detailed review of real-life images that each imager you're comparing can take. It's important to do that comparison yourself and not rely entirely on the images that they're posting as part of their advertisement. We have seen in the past other smaller organizations get bought into the smaller, more affordable apps or smartphone plugins where the success of that hasn't been super great. And so it ends up being a bit of a waste of money relative to investing in the proper imager the first time and obviously finding more value in the higher quality image. So I would, before we get into the conducting your home audits tips and tricks section, I did want to hand it back to Jim to introduce a bit of a quick survey. What we're trying to understand a little bit of is everybody's experience with single family homes and I guess typical energy audit work itself.
Okay, so pull us up and just let us know kind of what your interest or involvement is with home energy audits. Okay, so it looks like most people have responded, so I'm just going to close the poll so that we can share the results. So looks like most people, about 50%, are interested in energy audits. About a third of people actually manage energy audits. And then there's a few folks on the line as well, about 17% that actually conduct energy audits.
Perfect.
It probably helps you a little bit there, Kevin, in terms of who's on the line.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a helpful way to transition into the next part of our conversation. The idea here is to focus around what we've had good experience with in our neighborhood blitz thermal energy audit program. As I mentioned before, it was primarily targeted towards single family homeowners and the low cost, easily accessible weatherization strategies they can put in there. As we'll talk about when we get into the things to avoid section and some of the more detailed assemblies that we're going to discuss. We do stress the importance of having experienced contractors and experienced energy auditing professionals in the development of your program, especially if you're going to be doing audits by yourself or you're just interested in them for your own home or for your own organization. Making sure that you match your program to the level of experience and knowledge that the people holding the camera have is a very important piece to making sure the program is successful and that you avoid making recommendations which might be detrimental to the homeowner or perhaps put a bad taste in everybody's mouth with regards to the home energy audit process. Considering that, when we're talking about our tips and tricks, ideally what we're trying to discuss is the fundamentals around being prepared for the audit. So knowing the building and knowing the occupant and the usage there. We're interested in being familiar with different construction assemblies and failure points, not only from the perspective of conducting the audit the first time, so being able to understand exactly where the different failure points of the home are, but also being able to communicate what those failure points mean to the homeowner, to make sure that they're not misinterpreting the reviews that you'll find with the thermal imager. And potentially leading them astray or causing them to panic over thermal issues that might or might not be an actual problem. Knowing a bit about the history of the home, renovations are often a major problem with thermal enclosures. We often see insulation askewed or disrupted, and that can show up on the thermal imager. So knowing a little bit about that history can help in identifying which issues may or may not be relevant to the homeowner. And then ultimately asking the occupant about their experience can be hugely valuable as well. We often find that we're drawn to the cold rooms that the owner identifies for us as a means of trying to find real applicable solutions to their occupant issues. And ultimately, if you orient your program around thermal comfort as much as you do energy efficiency, that often strikes a better chord with the homeowner, especially when we consider that most of these major retrofits offer some difficult paybacks relative to the cost of energy in our area. But thermal comfort and the way that the occupant enjoys their space is somewhat priceless to most. When we're considering the next step after we've discussed the building and we understand a little bit about how we're going to proceed, it's important to pick the right day and understand the parameters that influence your thermal energy audit, whether it be the temperature between the indoor and outdoor, whether the furnace is on or off, and ultimately whether or not the owner is even available to proceed with you as part of the audit. all three of these parameters can have very different impacts on the overall success of the thermal imaging. And it's important to kind of discuss that in detail, as we will in a bit. When we move past that, it's obviously very important to focus on the detail. We'll talk a little bit about our experience with windows and switches and plugs, doors. Range hoods and dryer vents are a little bit more difficult to contextualize for most, but any understanding exactly what components of the building you're going to be conducting the thermal image of can or cannot fail thermally will be important to understand where you should be focusing your time when you're working around the building. And then ultimately having a good process in place, understanding that you should work your way from the top of the envelope down or from the windows and up, having in place a strategy for making sure that you've covered everything in the home is very, very important to have when you're going out on site. So when we're conducting our home audit, as I mentioned before, knowing your building is a very, very important aspect of conducting a successful thermal energy scan. What we often find is that the failure points most common with single-family residences are those subject to just the way we build buildings in the first place. The image on the left here is actually of a typical window assembly. So you'll recognize kind of the sill plate at the top of the framing, above your typical bad insulation, there's a bit of drywall, and then above all this is a window. And the only thing limiting air from penetrating through the exterior and into the interior is a small piece of foam identified at the end of that arrow there. More often than not, we know from experience that that foam can dry out and crack over time. Or the insulation that was packed into these spaces can eventually fall. Any number of things can compromise that seal. And that's why it's important to understand exactly how the window would likely be installed and what that assembly means, as a way of illustrating to the owner what they should be managing as part of their weatherization strategies or their energy retrofit. As it would show up on the thermal imager, it often shows in the form of a draft, and that's where the image on the left can be justified by understanding that the way the window is installed inherently has failure points around the window, and that's something to be focused on instead of perhaps the window assembly itself, which we know from experience typically performs poorer than an opaque window wall assembly. Similarly with doors, understanding that these doors are often subject to the most abuse in a home and can often fail as a result of just wear and tear is an important piece to understanding where and why you might be seeing thermal energy being lost through the gaps around the side. It's one thing to provide for the owner clarity around the fact that it's cold or drafty by their door. What we find offers the most value to occupants is being able to examine that door critically and appreciate that you should be looking for the failed seals or looking for the door that's out of square, possibly as the cause of the thermal loss or the thermal compromise, I guess, and what that might mean from a corrective action perspective for the owner. And that's, sorry, my apologies. That's best illustrated by the image on the bottom left there. So you can see this door is clearly at a square through the air gap on the left-hand side. And what that might show up on the thermal imager is that dark blue line with which is representative of cold air kind of circumnavigating the door itself. It's one thing to provide the owner with clarity around the cold air, but again, to acknowledge and look with your eyes the way in which the door is settling and the way in which it's being maintained will make a huge contribution to the overall value of the exercise when you're talking with the owner. Similarly, when you're knowing your building, you want to know about electrical boxes and the way they are installed in the building. More often than not, with single-family homes, they're wooden frame construction, which means that you've had a wood framer come in and then an electrical contractor. And more often than not, they've moved whatever insulation is there to place their electrical box, or the insulation contractor that came in following the electrician has just haphazardly placed insulation around that box. Often the sealing on these systems are not all that effective, and being able to properly convey that assembly and communicate why the outlets might be an issue for thermal leakage is an important piece when you're discussing things with owners. And then, as I mentioned before, understanding the impact of additions and what that could or could not do to the thermal envelope is an important part of that conversation. When we're talking about conducting the audit itself, as I mentioned before, picking the right day can be important, not only from the perspective of making sure you have a good contrast in both the exterior environment, hopefully being colder than the interior, which identifies for you those nice cold areas which you might otherwise make recommendations on, but it can also be an important factor in the results you're finding through the thermal imager. For example, the image on the right here is actually a great depiction of the effects of solar radiation on a single family home. So if you look at the image there, to the dark side of the peak of the roof, kind of right underneath the 80 there, that is actually more in line with the cold snow-covered background, as you can see by the mountains there. But then when you look at the roof, it's actually glowing red and demonstrate that there's heat. So that might not necessarily be representative of heat being lost through the ceiling. There might not be a thermal compromise in any of this assembly, but instead it's just solar radiation. And so what we want to avoid when we're conducting our thermal audits is taking an image like this and not accounting for the bright sunny day as a potential means for the results you're seeing in the camera. It's a bit of a critical thinking exercise, but I don't think it can be understated when you're conducting your audits to make sure that you're not misrepresenting or miscommunicating what you're seeing on the thermal imager and potentially directing the owner down a path which is not a great fit for their space. Similarly, we have seen things like prevailing winds be a major factor in draft management. More often than not, if you know which way the wind is coming from and which windows will be subject to the worst drafts, you can better direct the owner towards mitigating those drafts more effectively. And you can better manage your recommendations to ensure that the worst issues get addressed first instead of being drawn every which way within the house. And then this is specific to our experience with the program, but if you are going to conduct a thermal energy audit, it is often easier to walk through with the owner than it is to conduct the audit on your own and generate a report trying to communicate these things. There's a couple of reasons behind this, and as you'll see when we start to look at more thermal images as we go through the other assemblies, it can be very difficult to properly interpret a thermal image. For example, the house on the right here, if you were to just provide that to a homeowner and explain that there may or may not be heat loss in a roof assembly, that doesn't necessarily provide them any more or less insight than what they had at the beginning of the assessment. Instead, what you want to do is you want to spend time working with them to both clarify the image results you're finding on the imager with them so that they understand what's happening there, but also so that they have the opportunity to contextualize what they might be seeing. When we get into the roofs and ceiling section, you'll appreciate this a little bit more, but anecdotally, we have had a number of homes where we've identified issues in the insulation, and it would be as a result of an old rodent problem or an older moisture problem, which has since been resolved. If we were generating a report based on our information from the camera alone, we would lose the opportunity to perhaps mitigate that stress on the homeowner by encountering or encompassing their feedback around what's actually happening up there. And then ultimately, depending on what availability you have from volunteers, it does manage your time commitments a little bit better to be able to discuss the results with them. When we talk about how we focus on the details, it's important to appreciate the process by which you go through your thermal energy audit. Our experience and the process by which we conduct our thermal energy audits has been refined a fair bit over time. We did originally have a program where we had managed things obviously quite a bit differently than our blitz strategy now. And just for the sake of efficiency, we do manage our time quite efficiently within the space. And I would recommend you do the same in your reviews, only so that you can manage how much feedback you're providing to the owners and make sure that you can focus on the measures that are most important to them, in addition to going down the road with larger, more intensive energy retrofits. What I typically advise is that you allow time for the actual opening and closing of doors and the opportunity to make sure everything's fitting and sealing properly. More often than not, if a deadbolt can latch the door tighter and prevent that seal, without testing that deadbolt latch and seeing exactly how the door fits, you miss the opportunity to perhaps acknowledge and capture that function within your feedback to the owner. And then you miss the opportunity to avoid providing additional retrofits or actions that the owner could not have to do. In our experience with some homes as well, we found that for larger homes or larger scale audits, it is okay to be comfortable making assumptions around the assemblies and some of the details. I like to describe it as the 75% rule, but the idea is effectively if you've checked most of the outlets or you've checked most of the windows and they show similar signs of issue in their installation, whether it be a draft or whether there's a direct thermal bridge there which should be acknowledged, then you can probably assume that that assembly has been used throughout the house. And though you should still conduct an imaging of those specific items, you can spend less time explaining the results to the owner and allows you more time to focus on the functions of the doors and windows and making sure that you manage your time properly to get a detailed review of everything. It's also important to prepare that strategy with the owner. So our current Blitz model focuses specifically on working with the owner to establish how many rooms they're interested in investigating, what their experience is in the space, and whether there's any rooms we should be spending more or less time on. And specifically with single family homes, whether there's any spaces you can't go, teenagers' rooms, tenants, things that you just simply shouldn't be accessing. And what we typically recommend is that you do have your report prepared ahead of time so that you can manage the time you spend with the thermal imager. A lot of the time, owners will be interested in pulling you different directions, whether it be to chase down a draft that they felt at one point in time, or to perhaps hunt down a theory that they have or that they're working on within their homes. If you have a checklist you can stick to, it does allow you a bit of structure to help guide that audit a bit more closely and make sure that you do get to all the spaces in the home and not just get completely focused by the owner's intents. What I'm showing here is an example of the type of audit checklist we provide. As I mentioned before, our thermal image scanning is primarily focused on weatherization. So that's the lower cost, lower impact measures that a homeowner can take to manage their thermal comfort. We don't typically recommend larger door replacements or window retrofits as part of our program. And that's why our checklist is specifically tailored around entering a room, identifying the cold spaces or the issues that might be of concern to the homeowner, and then specifically identifying which weatherization strategies they can implement themselves in that room to better manage things. This structure is obviously not gospel. Your program will better dictate what types of feedback you want to provide, but it does illustrate the types of information you can be focusing on so that when you provide that report back to the homeowner, they know exactly what they should be doing to mitigate and manage the feedback you found as part of your thermal imaging scan. And then we get into the scan itself. And so what we're going to do here is kind of just focus, as I discussed earlier, from the top down, discussing the different assemblies and some of the common issues you might encounter as part of your thermal imaging scan. In our experience, there can be a vast variety of different faults or reasons for images that you might find through a thermal imaging scan. And so by no means does any of the feedback we're talking about in our conversation today represent the only things that you'll find on site. But in the audits we've conducted so far, these are kind of the most common issues and things that you should be aware of and prepared to look for as part of your scan. The image on the top right represents what we commonly see with old renovations as missing insulation. A lot of the time what you'll find is that perhaps there's been some work done on the roof which has involved removing some insulation to run a wire or to check something, and then as part of replacing it, it's either compromised that insulation or it's removed, or perhaps they've forgotten to replace the insulation altogether. There's been a couple homes we've been in where an addition to a kitchen was put on, and then the contractor went in with the bag of insulation to spread it around, and they ultimately did not spread it around. And so there was no insulation dispersed, despite it all being in the attic for the owner. That's a great example of, kind of the ideal findings of the thermal image, but it's not always what we see. To the right of that, identified as, I guess, figure 8 for the purposes of this conversation, is what you'll most often find with rodent damage or squirrels in the attic. What you'll notice here is that you can, through the thermal imaging, identify, I guess, compromises in the insulation and how that might reflect from like a nesting perspective. You'll notice that there's a bunch of darker spaces connected with laneways and walking paths between them. That is common of kind of a larger rodent infestation in the attic. More often than not, we see these and we identify them to the homeowner, but it's often an issue that has long since been resolved. Most people don't have critters actively living in their attic. And so a lot of the time we see the impacts of that in the thermal imaging a little bit down the road. And then the one on the bottom is water damage. This one can be the most dangerous when we're trying to discuss thermal imaging with the homeowner. A lot of the time when you hear water or a failure of the envelope as a whole, there can be a lot of questions and panic and concern over what's happening there. We'll talk about that in the things to avoid section kind of at the end of this. But what we find is that it's important to identify these items and discuss them with the homeowner, but ultimately make sure that they're directing their time and attention to a contractor who can better assess the impacts of your findings with the thermal imaging, not necessarily to provide feedback yourself and confirm wholeheartedly that their roof is leaking and that they're about to have a major issue. Other things to expect in the ceiling are things like pot light assemblies. Going back to what we were talking about knowing how the building is built. As some of you may or may not know, traditional code around pot light installation requires that insulation be kept a certain distance away from the pot lights, obviously for fire code to mitigate that hot lamp touching anything combustible. What you'll find is that with a lot of retrofits of these pot lights, you'll have this big cavity with a lack of insulation and then a lamp which no longer heats that cavity. And so these will show up as issues in your thermal image scan. But it's something that you should not be making recommendations around, because what you're ultimately encouraging is for the owner to mitigate code by placing insulation around their space. Similarly, there are things like roofing trusses, and as you can see in the top image here, there are faint lines which are somewhat unavoidable given the nature of construction in North America. And so we obviously want to mitigate risk. We want to mitigate scaring the homeowner by identifying these as major thermal issues, when in reality, they're just a typical part of the assembly. And then finally, oh, sorry, we gotta go back here. And then finally, skylights. I just want to touch on them really quickly. Skylights can be difficult to manage in a thermal imaging scan because we know that they perform like windows. They're always going to be thermally inefficient. And a lot of the time, there's a lot of framing and structure associated with their installation. We encourage people to do scans of them and to discuss them with the homeowner, but ultimately they're the most difficult items to provide retrofit feedback on. Moving past that, when we look at doors and windows, it speaks most to what we were discussing before about understanding the installation of the window or door itself, checking to make sure that it opens or closes properly, that it closes square, that there aren't any cracks, and that the finish of that window is still in place and not compromised is an important piece. Specifically with doors and windows, because they can be some of the higher draft items in the home, we do suggest that you don't rely completely on the camera when assessing these things. A lot of the time, given the way that the camera responds to light, it adjusts the spectrum relative to the coldest or hottest item it's viewing at the time. What ends up happening is something like an intensive thermal bridge of a window. So if you're looking at an all aluminum assembly, it's going to be very cold no matter what. And it will limit your ability to detect drafts because everything associated with it will just show up as a dark blue on the image. For that reason, we suggest that you move past that and rely on your own visual inspections, as well as a bit of a back of the hand draft test, where you're feeling for that cold air on your knuckles kind of thing, to ensure that you're doing a thorough investigation of the window and you're not wholeheartedly relying on the thermal image, because it can, in some cases, let you down. The other thing to be cautious of is writing off certain assemblies. So as I mentioned before, windows are always going to be considered a difficult space when you're conducting your thermal image. But in some cases, from a draft prevention perspective, older windows can perform better than newer modern aluminum assemblies. For that reason, you shouldn't necessarily see one high performance window as a perfect assembly and then choose not to scan it. More often than not, we'll find that there will be a bunch of variants or seals that fail in these different windows, and without doing that investigation and looking at them and inspecting them visually in addition to your thermal imaging scan, you miss an opportunity to potentially find some additional issues for the owner. And then ultimately, acknowledging the window assembly itself and that glass is always going to be heat loss, as I mentioned earlier, can help you mitigate your recommendations to the owner around expensive retrofits. When we move past that, we look at things like plugs. I'll try and speed through this because our feedback is relatively consistent around plugs. A lot of the time, you check your electrical outlets, your wall switches, and your junction boxes on every exterior surface, avoiding obviously wasting time within the thermal envelope. And you can appreciate whether or not that installation has been successfully installed. What's important to note with this is, again, that 75% rule can come in very helpful because there are a lot of outlets that you'll find. And if you can understand that the majority of them might be an issue for drafts, then you can better identify and make that recommendation to the homeowner so that they can make an action on all of the outlets, assuming that for the most part, it's still going to be a good cost comparison. Some of the experience we have taken away from past partnerships with fire departments are using our opportunities and our times in the homeowner's space to do an investigation on electricity and hot wires as well. We can do this for a couple of different reasons. From the energy perspective, we like to make recommendations around mitigating phantom loads for obvious reasons. And so when we can scan a power bar and identify all of the hot plug loads plugged into it, that represents the type of energy being wasted, and it's a good demonstration for the owner. But in addition to that, being able to identify hot wires or circuits that might be overloaded, it can be of value, especially if you see something that you think the owner should be aware of as part of just understanding their home and maybe mitigating the risk of fire. And then when we get past the outlets, we spend a bit of time in the basement. So the basement is a relative term depending on the way the house is laid out. But for the purposes of our conversation, when we're talking about the basement, we're talking about a bit of the heating and cooling infrastructure for the house. We're always focused on the hot and cold water pipes, and we want to make sure we talk about both of them. Hot water pipes can be an interesting one because if it's in an unconditioned space, then obviously that represents a heat loss to the owner. But what's also interesting is cold water pipes in a moisture-rich environment can also represent the issue for water and moisture damage. We have been in homes in the past where they have a cold water pipe which runs directly above a suite, like a basement ensuite shower, which was installed afterwards. And unfortunately, the owner wasn't really aware of the powers of condensation at the time. And so what we found through our thermal imaging was that the water condensing on that pipe was actually compromising the drywall and generating a whole bunch of problems, which he had been complaining about upstairs as well. So using that opportunity and that time with the homeowner to really identify these issues, and as we talked about earlier, discuss these types of issues with the homeowner so you can try and find those solutions for them. It goes above and beyond the thermal imaging scan, but it does offer a lot more value in your program, and I think that it's an important conversation to have in any opportunity. What we have also found as part of our scans is a review of the radiant floor heating is always important. More often than not, you'll find that the equipment is installed successfully and there aren't too many issues to be spoken of. But we have had instances in the past where there have been faults in the plumbing underground. Specifically, if you look at the image on the bottom right-hand side here, that's an illustration of the pipes being burst and effectively radiating that hot water down and under the house, compromising the building's heating system effectively. You know, it's not often we find major issues like this, but when the owner was complaining about a basement which was cold and not getting adequate heat, since you have the thermal imager there and you can check to see what type of piping infrastructure they might have on that ground level or how their heat's being dispersed, you can better identify where they may or may not be getting heat delivered to. And even that in its own can help them manage their expectations around how that space is going to be conditioned. Another great example is furnace ductwork. We have been to a number of homes which have furnace ductwork which runs through unconditioned spaces. So a great opportunity for energy improvement is obviously insulating those ducts. Without spending time digging around the basement and trying to understand the mechanical side of things, you miss the opportunity to make recommendations based on that as well. And then the last piece I want to recommend is One of the bigger penetrations you'll find in the envelope is around dryer vents. Just making sure that these are installed correctly and that the draft protection units on the outside of the building are there, if at all, and that the installation is properly sealed are all important components. And then the last piece here I want to hammer home, as we mentioned before, are some of the things you'd want to avoid as part of your own energy audit process. It's important to acknowledge that the thermal imager will often show you more information than you know what to do with. And you want to manage that information and contextualize it as best as possible, regardless of what level of energy audit you're conducting or whether you're conducting it for yourself in your own home. Knowing that certain things will be cold and certain things will be hot and appreciating the differences in between is what makes for a successful energy audit. A great example of that is actually the image on the top left here. That's actually just a typical stud wall with drywall screws in it. And you can see that there is a lot of heat radiating out of that, but without an extensive renovation of the exterior of the building where you're cladding in additional insulation at a pretty significant cost, it's not the type of recommendation that would do any significant value to the homeowner. Similarly, the image beside that, that's another representation of wood framing and the types of joints you'll find common in a residential home constructed for wood. Again, understanding that these types of heat losses are inevitable and to focus on something like the window below that, where you can have substantial draft air leakage, is the types of exercises you should be conducting. What we always want to avoid, unless you are a certified contractor or you have the opportunity to speak with professional experience, are the types of major expensive retrofits that you might find by focusing on windows and on doors. These can often be costly to the owner, and it creates a level of expectation that they'll find dramatic energy savings. As most of you may know, and as those who don't will know soon, energy can be a very complicated story, especially in single-family residential homes. There's a lot of components which go into energy savings, and it's difficult to suggest to a homeowner that one specific window or one faulty door is ultimately the cause of expensive utility bills. All of these things add up, but it's difficult to make a recommendation which solves all of them at once. And for that reason, we want to avoid making expensive retrofit recommendations wherever possible, as a means of making sure we keep that conversation limited to those who can speak to that experience most professionally. Similarly, we manage our commentary on water damage for the same reason. We don't know what the history there is and whether or not it's actually substantial and an ongoing issue, or whether perhaps it's evidence of a past problem which has since been resolved and we don't want to concern the owner over it. And then finally, as I mentioned before, and I can't stress enough, listening to the occupants of the space and making sure that they're present for your energy audit, in my opinion, is a very important piece there. We want to make sure that what they're seeing as part of that thermal imaging is something that they can contextualize and they're comfortable with, to avoid making rash decisions, or as we talked about before, seeking a one-time solution to their energy loss issues. For that reason, having them with you is very, very valuable, and it's something that you want to ensure you can get as often as possible. Frequently, we find that when we conduct the audits without the homeowner, they're busy that day or they're running around preparing for something. The feedback we provide them is not nearly as successful as what we would find if they were with us, engaged in the conversation. And then ultimately, I think it's important to just be confident with what you know and understand that you should be seeking expert advice when you don't. Again, that speaks to what we were talking about with major energy retrofits. But as a whole, when you're conducting your audits, make sure you understand what you can comfortably speak to so that you can focus on those elements with the homeowner. And if there is something that you're unclear of, don't be afraid to make recommendations or to refer them to their contractor in order to make those decisions themselves. Ultimately, it's their space and their investment in more cases than not, and you want to make sure that you respect that. And I think that's kind of the end of what we're talking about here. So I know we went through a fair bit of work, but I'll hand it back over to Jim to maybe facilitate a couple questions if there are any.
Yeah, that's great, Kevin. I appreciate your presentation, and I think a lot of the insights in terms of what's possible to do in a type of program that Cool North Shore has been running with volunteers, and so I think that's really really great to see in the examples. So we do have some time for questions. I guess, so if you do have a question, feel free to type into the question box there. While we're waiting, I'm just going to launch a quick poll. Because we're kind of interested in whether, if FBC had a thermal camera lending program, whether any First Nations communities would be interested in accessing a program like that, where you could borrow a camera for a period of time. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, or if you're have any insights from communities that you work with, if you're not with a First Nation. Okay, so we've had a few people respond. I think I'm just going to close the poll and share the results. So we've got, yeah, it looks like a fair number of people would be interested in. 3% would be interested. Of course, not everyone on the call here is with the First Nations community, so we understand that, but that's really useful for us in planning our future work. So we've got a couple of questions here. A question from Anna Tillman is, do you conduct energy assessments if a home is under renovations?
That's actually a great question, because I think that the opportunities presented while the home is under renovation, it makes it worth conducting that assessment. A great illustration of that is that, the first cost of adding an additional layer of insulation or making an informed decision around a window assembly or some additional ceiling measures can be illustrated by looking at the existing building and the way that those assemblies may or may not be failing. I don't think that it is necessarily appropriate to use that thermal imaging during a renovation to make strong recommendations over, adjusting the existing building. But if you are trying to use it as a means of contextualizing energy savings in that addition itself, then that's useful. It might be important to separate those two ideas. So you conduct a typical thermal energy scan of the existing building, looking for typical drafts and all these other different things in the areas that would not be affected by the renovation. And then in addition to that, have an informed conversation with your owner about how we could use some of the lessons learned in the existing part of the building in the construction of the renovation itself. All of those things can kind of work together in tandem and hopefully help out.
Okay, great. Looks like the poll question sort of helped answer one question we had here. Is someone had a question around if anyone rents thermal cameras. Have you heard of that, Gavin?
I have heard of it in some cases. I'm drawing a blank, to be honest, on who in the Vancouver market would have that equipment readily available. But if there are people specifically interested, I know that some of the smaller organizations that have these thermal cameras, and if FBC was trying to develop such a program, that is probably worth reaching out to them to discuss. I mean, it's a difficult conversation to kind of have if they haven't rented it out in the past, but it's worth asking. Even something like the Cool North Shore, I know we have our camera, and we'd be interested in partnering with other communities and organizations to make sure it gets used to its fullest extent.
Okay, that's great to hear. I had one other question is that, given that you mentioned that there's quite a range of equipment that's available these days, and the resolution of, even some of the camera-based phones seems to be sort of in the middle of the range that you presented. Are those cameras adequate for doing basic assessments of homes, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think for the most part, what we've found with our thermal imaging equipment is that it's largely a demonstration tool in the first place. As you probably caught on as part of like my presentation here and kind of speaking to our experience with our Cool Neighborhoods Blitz program, a lot of the time what we're doing is trying to facilitate a conversation around weatherization with the owner. And what we're doing is relying on that thermal imager as a means of illustrating what we're trying to discuss when we're talking about draft prevention or sealing up their home a little bit better, right? Considering that, if you can find a piece of equipment with a resolution which can adequately show you the cold spots, then I think that that is appropriate. And I don't necessarily think that the highest quality image is essential if you're doing a relatively low barrier thermal imaging program.
Right. Okay. Well, that's useful. Well, I think we're coming up to 12 o'clock, which is when our webinar is scheduled to end. So we respect everyone's time here. And I think I'm just going to wrap things up and thank our speaker, Kevin Welsh, for sharing his experience as part of the Cool North Shore program. Thanks very much. And we hope everybody has a great afternoon. There will be a recording of this webinar available after if there's something that you'd like to review again. And thanks again for joining us today.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.